everyone is wondering what you guys, the main Valve team, are doing right now, and where Half-Life is headed.
I got nothing to say about Half-Life.
Valve is experimenting using Half-Life characters, environments, ideas, and other assets in its virtual reality technology. Valve programmer Jeet Barnett told Kotaku during GDC, quote, "We've said, let's take some existing art and see how it fits. But right now, it's a tool for exploring the different kind of game designs we want to do. Things are still up in the air for a Half-Life VR game. We're not saying no, but we don't know what the right thing is just yet."
This is such a special day for me, and I'm sure for many of you, because Valve is ready to reveal its next project. So what is it? Well, it's a new Half-Life project.
It's hard to believe that we ever reached this point, and that it took almost 13 years. "13 years just so happens to be how old I was when I first discovered Half-Life. On this piece of junk laptop that doesn't even work anymore, I sunk countless hours into Half-Life and Half-Life 2 and the episodes, and then any other Source Engine game or mod I could get my hands on. I fell in love with it. It was one of the most unique experiences I had ever had. And when I experienced that cliffhanger that kept everyone waiting, I too joined them in twiddling my thumbs patiently and making jokes about another game being released someday. By the time that I was finishing middle school, I was a bona fide fanboy, and everyone that knew me even semi-closely would eventually hear me talk about how great these games were and how much I looked forward to a new one. So much so that by the end of the year, I had collected a number of goodbye messages from people hoping that I would one day get to play it. Maybe then I'd finally shut up about it. I preface with all this to drive home the point that this series is something I hold quite dear. It was part of a very formative period of my life, and it was influential in helping me begin to think critically about the games I was playing, which in turn helped me develop a taste for games that evolved into what I enjoy today. So, when in 2019, I got the news that a new game was finally going to be released, and that it would be a prequel to Half-Life 2, I was simultaneously excited and also a bit nervous. Valve was not doing too well when it came to public perception, and for the first time I felt genuine doubt that they could deliver something that would meet people's expectations. It's akin to meeting an old friend after years of not having kept in touch. You could enjoy their company just as much as before, or they might have grown and changed, no longer resembling that version of themselves that you fondly remember. How would you even greet them? Do you just ask them how they've been? Do you ask them where they've been? What have they been up to this whole time? Do you just shake hands and pick up right where you left off? Frankly, I'm not sure. But I do know this. After many years of absence, it can feel pretty good to see a familiar face. Or, at the very least, the back of it. As it turns out, this whole virtual reality thing is actually pretty fun, and it looks like it's here to stay. It also turns out, to everyone's collective sigh of relief, that Valve still knows how to put together a good Half-Life game, even after all this time. The newest entry in a franchise that lay dormant for so long it became the subject of endless ridicule has been dubbed the killer app that the VR market desperately needed, and with good reason. I was lucky enough to already own a VR headset when Half-Life Alyx released, and I got to play it on day one, and honestly, I loved it. from start to finish. It holds the distinguished title of being one of the very few games that has ever made me cry, and the only one that has ever made me cry twice. However, the more I kept playing, there was this thought building in the back of my head. I couldn't help but think about this other game that seemingly relates to it somehow. An older game, came out in the late 90s, early days of 3D graphics, pretty interesting gameplay for its time. It has a story about man meddling with nature and nature biting back. An experiment gone horribly wrong. The protagonist isn't a space marine or a trained soldier, they're just an average human trying to survive and escape. And the most interesting part of it all, it's not Half-Life. It's not even close. It's the 1990s, and the video game business is booming.
You know, it's not even Halloween yet, but millions of kids already know what they want for Christmas, a new video game system called Nintendo 64.
The hardware market marches forward to the beat of Moore's Law, and developers are implementing all kinds of crazy new ideas. Many studios rooted themselves in the public consciousness of this decade. One of them was Valve Software. You've probably heard of them. But many miles to the south, in the city of Los Angeles, California, a completely different studio would be born. Born, at least partially, by the desire of film director Steven Spielberg to work on interactive media.
Although he's a shrewd businessman, everyone who knows Spielberg says he's still very much like a precocious kid.
There we go.
Even his office is filled with toys, although they're, for the most part, adult toys.
This is the kind of place where potentially we could get no work done.
In 1995, a joint venture between DreamWorks, a production company he co-founded, and Microsoft saw the creation of DreamWorks Interactive, a video game development studio. Its early history is not particularly noteworthy.
Fairy tales do come true. It can happen to you with Steven Spielberg's Director's Chair from DreamWorks Interactive and Knowledge Adventure.
Today, they're probably best known for giving birth to the Medal of Honor series and Call of Duty as a direct consequence. But before their famous World War II title cemented them in the history of the medium, they tried to make a dinosaur game. A dinosaur game that was supposed to be the best game anyone had ever played. Trespasser was designed to be a sequel to the second Jurassic Park film. You play as a young woman named Anne who crash lands on Site B, the place where research and experimentation takes place for international genetics. Your task is simple: explore the island, radio for help, and get rescued. Oh yeah, and try not to die while you're at it. Steven Spielberg's personal investment in the project helped to attract star power to the game's cast, with Minnie Driver voicing Anne and Sir Richard Attenborough reprising his now iconic role as John Parker Hammond.
My name is John Parker Hammond. I was born on March 14th, 1928. What follows is a record of certain events in which I took part between the years 1980 and 1997 on an island I will call Site B. Site B was not to be a theme park, but a research station. This was where we did the real work.
The project was spearheaded by two former Looking Glass employees, Seamus Blackley and Austin Grossman. Ambitions were high, so was the budget. Development was difficult. The team set out to create a complex 3D island environment designed to run on computers of the mid to late 90s. Combine this with all the new and novel gameplay ideas that were being implemented, and you've got a recipe for quite an undertaking. Things started taking a turn for the worse when the game missed its intended release window of fall 1997. The budget was cut, and a new tight deadline was set for the following year. In a huge rush to wrap up production and get the game on store shelves, features were removed, entire levels and set pieces were cut, and the game was shipped in a less than ideal state. The development cycle had been long and arduous, but the end product was finally released on October 28, 1998. Three weeks before Half-Life. Okay, so the game came out in a busy and crowded 1998 release window. Late 1998 was definitely a great period for PC video games. Fallout 2, Half-Life, Sin, Baldur's Gate. Oh, and hey, you remember Looking Glass? The former employer of the two project leads? Yeah, they were getting ready to put out this other game. What was it called again? Oh yeah, Thief, The Dark Project. You know, a game that would pave the way for 3D stealth games to become popular, along with Tenchu and Metal Gear Solid, both of which also came out in 1998. All of this is to say that Trespasser, was facing some stiff competition at release, and it needed to work extra hard to stand out. But if it at least got some favorable press coverage and good word of mouth, I'm sure things would be okay, right? Right?
Trespasser is an impressive technical demo. It just isn't a game.
As bad as genetically re-engineering dinosaurs turned out to be in Jurassic Park movies, Trespasser definitely tops them in the good idea gone horribly wrong department.
Trespasser is an ugly mishmash of uncertain identity crippled by ill-conceived ideas, a technically promising engine that screws up gameplay, and more horrendous glitches than 10,000 men could shake 10,000 sticks at.
Worth checking out if you're interested in the evolution of technology, but that's all it really is.
Trespasser is a frustrating game filled with boring gameplay and annoying bugs.
To the marketing people of DreamWorks, I salute you. To gamers everywhere, I warn you. While you've certainly got to appreciate Trespasser simply for its originality, overall the game has turned out to be a Tyrannosaurus-sized disappointment.
The more I explored, the more I just got frustrated with the poor game design. In my opinion, Trespasser is a step back in nearly every imaginable way.
I'll admit the premise is admirable. To create a virtual world where you can do anything that's possible in real life sounds intriguing. DreamWorks did not create that world. Do not waste your time and money on Trespasser. It is a very underdeveloped game.
Though the designer's vision of a living world delivers some genuinely memorable moments, the serious issues regarding performance make Trespasser impossible to recommend, and yet he gave it 62? The fuck?
The project absolutely bombed, both critically and financially. It did so badly, in fact, that it damaged Steven Spielberg's interest in developing more games. DreamWorks Interactive would eventually be absorbed by Electronic Arts and be rebranded as EA Los Angeles. Seamus Blackley, having impressed none other than Bill Gates with a demo of Trespasser, would go on to work at Microsoft, where his greatest contribution would be leading the charge on a project that would ultimately become the Xbox. Typically, this is the point where the story of this game and the company behind it would end. But there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. Believe it or not, this game has a lot to contribute to the discussion of another, much more modern game in a different franchise, played in an entirely different form factor. Though they might seem distinct and at most loosely tied to each other, a stronger bond becomes apparent upon closer inspection. And all of it begins by sharing a very simple idea. No matter how immersive and complex video games strive to become, technological constraints mean that they can't fully simulate the experiences they depict. Still, it doesn't mean they can't come as close as possible. To go from something crude and primitive to more true-to-life recreations, it's not enough to rely entirely on the advancement of technology. Design sensibilities also need to progress along with it. Specifically, to make a more realistic or believable experience, I posit that there needs to be a reduction in abstraction. This is the kind of subject that opens a giant can of worms before you even begin to delve deeper into it. You see, abstraction is a word that can be applied in a lot of different subjects, and its meaning can morph and mutate depending on the context of what exactly is being discussed. For example, the field of metaphysics presents the idea of nouns which can be concrete or abstract. A word like food can represent a real-world physical item, but a word like hunger represents an immaterial idea. In the domain of software, abstraction is used to describe a simplification of technological systems and how a user or developer can interact with them. For example, a graphics library that can render a cube without a programmer having to manually work with vertices, edges, perspective projection, or APIs that actually draw things on the screen. And this definition is somewhat loosely related to the issue at hand, but it's not entirely fitting. When I refer to abstraction, I'm really talking about an aspect of the way something is designed. It's a variable that, as it goes up or down, can influence the intuitiveness of an experience. In the context of video games, having less abstraction in your design would be something that helps a player understand something better, because it ties into what they're already familiar with from the real world. It also means that by removing these abstractions wherever possible, the player can have an easier time transitioning from feeling like they're just playing a game to having a highly engrossing experience. I'm going to give an example that isn't related to video games at all, and then I want you to keep these ideas in your head throughout the entirety of this video. Consider, for a second, a light bulb. It's something that virtually everyone will be familiar with how to operate. You flip a switch, and it turns on. You flip it again, and it turns off. Please hold any questions until the end. Now consider this smart light bulb. Technologically, this bulb is orders of magnitude more complex than a traditional one. It connects to a hub and uses a low-latency wireless communication protocol to execute commands like turning on or changing color or whatever. But ultimately, to the end user, none of that really matters. And it shouldn't have to. It's the job of designers and engineers to make sure that when a user interacts with it, it should feel just as natural as when they do with a regular bulb. All of that technological nuance gets abstracted away. This is a good compromise. It doesn't have the tactility of being a physical thing to interact with, but at least it can mimic it and be good enough. It's the reason why turning it on involves toggling a digital light switch, not drawing a triangle and then turning your phone upside down. But to make the interaction less abstract, you could just use a regular light switch mounted on the wall. It gives an end user less to think about because it will behave like the same system they're already familiar with. Generally, video game development relies on abstraction to create experiences that are convincing enough to the player, but that are feasible to design and implement. Oftentimes, these abstractions are so widespread as to become standardized. It doesn't mean, however, that they can never be challenged. This kind of abstraction takes many different forms in video games. It can manifest as abstract environments, abstract methods of interaction, and abstract feedback or consequences as a result of these interactions. What would happen if developers began stripping away some of these layers of abstraction to really try and make seemingly all aspects of the experience feel natural and realistic and intuitive? What would a game like that look like? what would it play like? Well, you wouldn't have to look very far. Both Trespasser and Half-Life Alyx were made with these ideas in mind. Both games made an effort to remove abstractions from their core design, each in their own unique way and each to their own degree of success. By the nature of their development teams rejecting a lot of the conventions of traditional game development and aiming instead to really try and push the boundaries of what the medium could do, both managed to stand out from their contemporaries and instead draw themselves closer to each other, beginning with how they both present to the player their respective worlds. For about as long as games have had graphics, they've used them with the goal of letting you pretend that you're in a completely different place. Well, actually they've been trying to do that since before they even had graphics. Anyone who's played a text adventure game can tell you that it's possible to conjure images of all kinds of environments using little more than elegant prose. You're standing at the end of a road before a small brick building. Around you is a forest. A small stream flows out of the building and down a gully. Look around. I don't know the word around. It's the reason why immersive is the word that often gets brought up in conversation when discussing great video game worlds, or when technology takes a leap ahead. Constantly pushing for higher fidelity graphics and sound is a nice way to help the player become more engrossed in an experience. But there's just one problem with that. As these worlds become more complex, it greatly increases both the technological requirements for manifesting them and the amount of data required to store them. Today, most, if not all, games can feature expansive worlds and detailed environments and let the player navigate them seamlessly with minimal interruptions. But that hasn't always been the case. Throughout the entire history of humans playing games, there has been a tendency to create defined spaces for these games to take place. It applies to sport, it applies to board games, tabletop role-playing, you name it. These spaces are, for the most part, utilitarian. They exist to set the boundaries of the play space. But when games began to make their way into the digital age, the relationship between player and play space would be completely redefined. Play spaces became levels, which in turn became the digital worlds that we know today. In the early days of arcades and home consoles, a new level could simply mean a new tweak to the same gameplay as before. In Pac-Man, for example, the game would modify values in the internal logic to make bonus items more valuable and make the gameplay faster and more challenging. Admittedly, this approach seems rather simplistic and is more akin to changing the difficulty mode than what we would now consider a different level. But when every byte of memory counts, there's not a lot of room left for a more creative solution. Fast forward to the days of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and now designers have more room. A new level can now represent an entirely new stage, with new data capable of being loaded in and out of memory to represent entirely new environments. A game like Super Mario Bros. Treats its stages as discrete units of gameplay. There are means by which the player can move from one level to the next, but each is ultimately disconnected from the last. You move from point A to point B, but there's not exactly a lot of room for exploration. Compare this to a game like The Legend of Zelda or Metroid, which creates environments that actually do feel interconnected. Every screen or stage feels like part of a cohesive whole, something larger than itself. You're more likely to interpret every section less as a level to be completed and more as an environment worth exploring. Even with how simplistic these areas look, you can make a mental map of them, or, an actual map if that's what you really want. It's a subtle change for sure, and you might not have realized it, but your subconscious probably did. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with Super Mario Bros. Or with having individual levels, and I'm also not saying that a game with interconnected levels is automatically better. But it would be hard to argue that one presents the player with a more interesting space than the other. As games continued to improve, these design philosophies were carried forward. Early shooters like Doom and Quake decided to keep in place the discrete level structure. Each level is disconnected from the rest. They have literal level exits and slipgates and intermission screens that serve as a pause before transitioning to a new stage. However, the idea of letting environments naturally flow into each other was also being preserved. Only 1 year after Doom, there was another first-person game that was released, one with no exit signs, no intermission screens, and the ability to let the player freely navigate their way through an entire space station to soak in the atmosphere and experience the story. That game was System Shock, a game made by Looking Glass, whose credits include the names of the two people who would then lead Trespasser's development. System Shock was an early example of adapting an interconnected environment structure into a game with 3D environments played from a first-person perspective. Citadel Station has become an iconic setting in the series, letting the player freely navigate through its individual sections. They feel like self-contained units with transition points between them, but they nonetheless help remind the player that despite feeling separate, each of these sections is a unique part of a larger, more complex structure. Fast forward just a few years, and games like Half-Life and Trespasser are refining this concept even further. Now, instead of using transition areas in a space station, you could just jump over a big gate, or walk down a hallway, and then continue directly from there. By letting areas flow from one to the other after loading, it reinforces the idea that you're just experiencing an unbroken journey. These kinds of games do a great job at convincing you that you're navigating through an environment that's far larger than what any individual level could show you. A huge leap from other games that just give you piecemeal environments with no connection to each other. The level designers instead allow you to just pick up from where you left off. Yes, there are still going to be separate levels, but at this point, that's just a limit of technology, not creativity. And suddenly, as this new and novel approach to level design is combined with the fact that it's all being rendered in 3 dimensions, the player can immerse themselves so much more in the experience. Games like Half-Life and Trespasser begin to exhibit the capacity for a new phenomenon, presence. A state in which someone perceives a virtual space to be real. For the first time, someone can be so engrossed in an experience as to become genuinely lost inside another world. Trespasser does a pretty good job at allowing this to happen organically. The way levels can sometimes merge from one to the other shows that the development team was well aware of the impact that a newfound sense of freedom would have on the experience of traveling through the environment. They also understood that this environment was capable of storytelling, and that not all of those stories should be told directly. You might start to notice that this place clearly looks like it's designed to have people here, but no one's around. And then you notice some abandoned vehicles or a pile of human remains. And even if you know nothing about Jurassic Park, you might start to put 2 and 2 together. Clearly, there's an attempt here to use environmental details for creating a foreboding atmosphere, and to let the player piece together the clues of what horrors had taken place in Site B before they ever stepped foot in it. In a 1997 interview with Wired, Seamus Blackley said, "There are things that work really well in the computer game medium. The feeling of environment, space, and ability to explore something on your own that you really don't get in other media." Half-Life is often praised for having succeeded at exactly this. It turned Black Mesa into a believable place. Every level had a dual purpose as being a playground for combat and platforming and puzzles, but also an effective way to deliver a story and atmosphere. Valve, even in their earliest days, understood that finely crafted environments and the stories those environments could tell can elevate the experience as a whole. But if this quote proves anything, it proves that they weren't the only ones. It's a real shame that one of these did quite well and the other shot itself in the foot. Hardware limits of the 1990s meant that level design for 3D games had to be fairly rudimentary. Looking at 3D graphics on your very own home computer was this new and revolutionary idea. Everyone takes for granted these days that you can render millions of lit, shaded, texture-mapped polygons on your phone, but back then, something like that was not a trivial task. Doing it fast enough to play games was even harder. Still, people made it work. It helps that a game like Half-Life is mostly set in confined indoor environments. Science laboratories and office spaces and underground railway tunnels. Even when the game does let you venture outdoors, it doesn't exactly give you a vast swath of terrain. The cliffside section, for example, puts most of the vista in the 2D skybox texture. But even with all these limitations, the game just does the most with what it can. It succeeds at presenting an environment that feels authentic and fun to explore and become invested in, and it has just the right level of fidelity to really help sell the effect. It limits the play spaces to reasonable sizes, and it gives the player enough detail to let their imagination fill in the gaps. Now, compare this to Trespasser. The development team tried to create a complex tropical setting with lush jungles and vast stretches of terrain, environments rich in organic detail and vegetation. It's the kind of thing that, even today, it takes a lot of effort to get right. On a computer of the late 90s, forget it.
I keep on trying to remind myself to send Todd Howard an email, but there's one moment when I first got Skyrim, and I started out, I was marching through the forest, and I had to stop, and I was just crying. I was crying, and I just had to cry and stop and take a walk, because what was on the screen was exactly my ultimate fantasy of what I wanted walking through the forest to be like in Trespasser.
Yeah. The game ran pretty poorly, and time has not been kind to its visuals. In a previous video, I mentioned that good art direction can make up for lack of raw visual fidelity, and this game is the perfect example of what not to do. You can't strive for 3D photorealism with a polygon budget of 2, maybe 3. To make matters worse, the low polygon terrain has textures that don't UV properly. For those of you unaware, UV mapping is the technique by which textures are projected onto geometric surfaces. But Trespasser does a terrible job at this. Almost every texture in the environment is warped or stretched, and it makes the entire landscape look just really fucking ugly. I mean, look at this. God, look at this. Look at this! That being said, it's not all bad. A few levels manage to stand out above the rest, a town and a laboratory. They both provide a break from the journey of traveling through wilderness. After all, what's a journey without a destination? They give the player a mix of indoor and outdoor exploration, with the town in particular having landmarks like a downed pole, a basketball court, and Hammond's home to aid in navigation. They also give the player a reason to care. Musical stings encourage the player to stop and reflect on the space that they're exploring, something that was once a functional community, but which is now deserted. In order to progress, the player needs to visit the home of Henry Wu and John Hammond himself, with his voiceovers becoming deeply personal as you rummage through the remains of his residence.
Lord Darley's charity lunch and a society event, £200 a ticket. A bit of a step up for me socially. I was seated with this very pleasant young woman. I would gaze at her dinner parties in moments when she was distracted. The hair on her upper lip, the way she exhaled the smoke from a cigarette. I stammered it. I was not certain what I should say. She laughed though and seemed charmed. She asked me to call again tomorrow. At 2 a.m. I called once again. She had still not come home, nor did they know where she was. I didn't leave my name.
The lab makes it clear that this is where experiments were being done that led to the demise of Site B and the outbreak that you've been battling this entire time.
The main laboratory and administrative buildings, this was where we made our discovery, where the real magic trick happened. When they come to dig up our secrets, they'll come here.
You're given context that helps you become invested in the place you're taking in. In other words, it helps build a sense of presence. But even at this stage, there are still some abstractions in place. The game might try really hard to convince you that the space you're navigating is real, but how real can it get when you're viewing it on a 2D screen? What if that big leap in fidelity and immersion could be taken again?
But so what we've got on this is, the hope is that so this is called the Oculus Rift, and Palmer Luckey he's going to be starting a Kickstarter to fund the first batch of 100 kits or so.
It wouldn't be until decades later when consumer-grade virtual reality equipment could tackle that challenge. To go from 3D to fully stereoscopic 3D, the height of immersion. In fact, the popularity of VR devices reignited the discussion of presence in video games. It's no longer just about crafting an intricate world and fooling the player into thinking they're a part of it. Now you can physiologically simulate the experience of being in a completely different place. If players are given this kind of newfound freedom to become lost inside other worlds, well, designers have plenty of incentive to create worlds worth exploring. Half-Life benefited from the jump to VR, and it made smart adjustments to really take advantage of the new perspective. Something as simple as just the fact that you move more slowly impacts how much you can allow a player to take in the scenery. It guarantees that they can't just run through an area and not pay attention, so you might as well give them something to look at or a reason to stick around just a few seconds longer. Valve understood this when making Half-Life Alyx, and that's why the resin mechanic came about. If you give a player a resource to collect, and you give them a worthwhile reason to collect it, they have a justification for opening every box, searching every filing cabinet, turning a whole room upside down until they've made sure that every nook and cranny has been combed through.
With the increased fidelity of VR, players not only expected to be able to interact with a vast array of objects, but they also had a strong desire to find something useful from time to time. This was so universal among testers that in addition to more searchable locations and interactive objects, we added a new resource, resin. Level designers could place this new resource in fun and interesting locations that weren't tied to game progression, rewarding players wider-ranging exploration. We also tied this new resource to a longer-term goal in the form of weapon upgrades, further motivating players to explore the environment. Deep scavenger hunts and keen observation would result in more resin to spend as a reward.
Oh, that really worked, didn't it? Huh.
Trespasser has no version available in VR. That is, unless you count the unofficial port in the form of a mod for Half-Life Alyx. And, honestly, yeah, it makes perfect sense. I can't help but feel that its tropical setting and its emphasis on exploration and its already low walking speed translates perfectly. Seamus Blackley was right when he described how he thought players experience 3D worlds, but this is all of that and then some. It shows just how far video games have progressed that my subconscious thinks of these spaces no longer as game levels, but something akin to actual places. Half-Life Alyx claims the title of being the most immersive experience I've had in any video game to date. Half-Life 2 only showed limited parts of City 17, but it was enough to let the player's imagination construct an idea of a dystopian metropolis. I had spent many hours in City 17 and its surrounding areas playing Half-Life 2, but I could never really say that I felt like I had been there, that I saw everything with my own two eyes and I witnessed it all firsthand. But now that's changed. I feel like I walked for miles, like I explored every square inch that was accessible to me, and that even when I close my eyes and take off the headset, I can still vividly remember those places and what I did there. It's the most present I have felt in any environment that, well, isn't actually real. But even if we can enjoy the fruit of all that progress, we can't forget all the steps that were taken to get here. The level design of Half-Life Alyx is a continuation of the work done for Half-Life 2 and Half-Life before it. But if you give me a full, from-the-ground-up VR recreation of Trespasser, I would happily trek through its jungle, just as I did City 17. The comparison can't really end there, however, for once you've given a player a meaningful world to explore, why not give them a meaningful way to interact with it as well? Video games are a very unique form of media. They share some characteristics with books or cinema, but they manage to stand apart by the nature of their interactivity. The player is given a chance to steer their experience, to go from passive spectator to active participant, to really be the one in control. But have you ever stopped to think about how they're in control? When you play a game, how do you do things? Whatever character or entity is in your control can probably do a whole lot. Move, jump, attack, interact with the environment, speak to other characters. But you, the player, what exactly are you doing the entire time? For decades now, it's been accepted that games reduce complex interactions to a less complex interface. It doesn't matter how complicated or nuanced the action will be, all a designer has to do is program in what sequence of inputs will make it happen. Thus, all of the complexity is abstracted away as more simplistic inputs. This design philosophy worked just as well in the 1970s as it still does today. One outcome of this approach is the inclusion of the all-encompassing use key in modern games. Just as there is a key to jump or crouch or shoot, there's likely going to be an input dedicated entirely to interacting with things. On paper, not a bad idea. In practice, it's a bit mundane, isn't it? The specifics of what exactly you're trying to do doesn't make a difference. It's just a single button press away. Whether you want to call an elevator, open a door, toggle a switch, pick up an item, start a conversation, get in a vehicle, that use key carries a lot of weight as a consequence of these abstractions. But how would a designer make this any better? At the heart of the matter lies the idea that if you start removing these input abstractions, you, the player, are going to be the one in full control. And if you're going to give the player more control, well, we're going to need something a little better than this. To put a player in a greater sense of control over their experience, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better candidate than virtual reality. The headset's tracking allows for fine adjustments of the visual perspective, and motion-tracked controllers can give a convincing sense of hand presence. Yeah, that's right, motion controls. You know, that thing that everyone swore up and down that they hated and was bad and it would never amount to anything. That same thing that started all the way back with the Nintendo Wii, the PlayStation Nintendo Wii, and oh god, the Kinect. Look, I know I don't just want to preach to the choir, but I really never got on board with the Kinect. I had 3 different chances to use it, and all of them went terribly. The tracking was really poor, and I never saw any games that used it to do anything in a way that couldn't be done more easily by just pressing buttons on a controller, which is entirely the opposite point of what I'm trying to make this entire section be about. I know it's had some successful uses in scientific and medical fields, and there's entire communities of programmers and hardware hackers that are giving these things a new lease on life, and that's great, but I just personally don't like it. I don't want to be the controller.
You are the controller.
No, lady, I don't want to be the controller. Although it's obviously new and rather novel, the VR controls for Half-Life Alyx, and a bunch of other VR games for that matter, can be relatively easy to pick up and learn. Some control designs from traditional flat-screen games are still going to be present in VR. Like any big leap in technology, it's going to carry some old stuff forward. You can innovate quite a lot, but you're not going to be able to eliminate the concept of pressing buttons or moving analog sticks anytime soon. But you can make it a bit more natural, like the grip button. It's called a grip button because it mimics the act of you gripping something. These are things that are becoming more standardized in VR hardware today, and they can trace their roots back to traditional control schemes. But other aspects, like looking around and using your hands to interact, these are handled by motion controls, and thus an extension of your own body. So, to put all that in a better context, here's an example of what I mean. I want you to think back to any game that you've played that has a leaning mechanic. You know, you can lean from side to side. Well, this mechanic is in the game to begin with because someone had to deliberately choose to include it. Then, presumably, they had to make a bunch of other decisions, like, for example, what buttons make it happen? How far does the player's view actually lean? How quickly does it happen? Are we actually tilting the camera perspective, or are we just shifting it to the side? If it's a stealth game, you'd have to consider whether or not the player can be detected while they check around a corner. If it's a multiplayer game, you now have to animate worldview models so that other players can see you leaning, and so on and so forth. Implementing this mechanic is inherently a form of abstraction. In real life, leaning is a very nuanced task from a physical point of view. You can lean only a little by moving your head to the side or rotating your torso, or you can lean a lot and adjust your stance to compensate for the change in your body's weight distribution. But in a traditional game, you're not really thinking about any of this. You press a button and the perspective changes. That is it. There wasn't a lot of thinking to be done in the first place. What results from an abstraction like this is a mechanic that can only function within the constraints of its implementation. And if you play another game that has the same mechanic, sure, you can lean around corners, but it won't be exactly the same every time. In virtual reality, it can be exactly the same every time, because that abstraction is removed. No one needs to decide whether or not a leaning mechanic needs to be implemented because the camera controls are now basically duct taped to your cranium. In virtual reality, every game has a leaning mechanic. This is the kind of opportunity and flexibility that can be given to the player by removing abstraction from control. A VR game like Half-Life Alyx takes full advantage of it, and it has a lot to gain by doing so. Things like opening doors or picking up objects feels just natural and realistic. The game's entire introduction is designed to be a short microcosm that showcases many of the things that you're able to do specifically because VR affords you the chance to do them. You can pick up and manipulate items of different shapes and sizes, you can draw on the window, you can physically press a button to receive a call, you can open a large metal door by sliding it, immediately followed by 2 other doors that have been left ajar in opposite directions, so you'll want to pull one of them and push the other. You can toggle light switches, call an elevator. So many things that previously would have been done by hammering a use key can be done directly by the player just as they would do it in real life. The designers do a good job of naturally introducing these concepts and establishing an understanding of how much more freedom virtual reality gives you as a player. And it's this freedom that then gets carried forward throughout the entire experience. This is the way in which Half-Life Alyx and virtual reality games as a collective innovate in how it lets players exert control over the characters they embody. Some aspects of this freedom are unlocked just by the fact that it's a virtual reality game to begin with. So, what about Trespasser? It's not a VR game. It's designed to be played on a 2D screen with mouse and keyboard inputs. How are these controls given freedom from abstraction? Is that even possible? Well, virtual reality gives you a motion-tracked controller, a type of input device, to hold in your hand, which then matches those movements to a virtual hand in the game. Trespasser tries its absolute hardest to replicate that concept, but only with a mouse. You are given normal movement and mouse look controls, but at any point you can switch the mouse from looking around to controlling Anne's right arm. And this approach is... oh boy. You see, a motion-tracked VR controller has what is known as 6 degrees of freedom. This means you can move it left and right, forwards and backwards, and up and down, as well as rotate your wrist in 3 different ways, causing pitch, yaw, and roll. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but your average computer mouse, it can't do all that. You can move it in a 2-dimensional plane and cause the arm to move up, down, left, right. But you have to resort to pressing other keys if you want to do literally anything more complicated than that. The execution is, frankly, janky as all hell. But I can't deny that it's a fascinating idea to watch unfold. I mean, really think about how much of an outside-the-box concept this was for its time, or forget its time, even today. Most games are happy to let you press a button and let everything happen. In Trespasser, an actual simulated hand comes out of your body, and you need to maneuver it to get anything done. Similar to virtual reality, it really tries to really put the player in a better state of control over their actions. As interesting of an idea as it is, however, I won't deny it, its implementation is woefully unpolished. When you first start playing, the arm's movement is going to feel very sluggish, and God help you if you need to try and rotate something in a very specific way. And yet, maybe it's because I went into it with an open mind, or maybe the introductory level gave me just enough time to get acquainted with it, but I stopped thinking about it and it just sorta started to make sense. I learned how to wrestle with the controls and maneuver the arm just right so I could make decent use of it and beat the whole game. I learned to enjoy the extra bit of freedom that the game was granting me with this esoteric control scheme, and it led me to better appreciate how Half-Life Alyx and other VR games with hand presence felt like those same ideas were finally done justice. My favorite example of all of this coming together is, believe it or not, keycards. Games like Doom and Quake and Duke Nukem 3D, they all had keycard hunting. It was really simple. There's a locked door, it needs a keycard. So you find it and walk over to it, and it gets picked up. So you walk back into the door, and now it opens. But in Trespasser and Half-Life Alyx, you, yourself, have to physically reach out and actually grab an item, and then carry it in your hand back to the door, and press it against a reader. And then you're done with it and you can throw it away and keep going. It's such a minor little thing that you would give absolutely no thought to in any other game. But by making the experience focus on the player being more in control of their actions, it brings such a fascinating breath of fresh air to an old concept that's been done 1,000 times before. And the fact that both games share this exact same sequence really showcases how much more natural one is to control than the other. The VR controls of Half-Life Alyx feel like they're being ripped right out of Trespasser and just given a much-needed new coat of paint. Now, removing constraints and abstractions inherent to a control scheme is all well and good, but if you're going to use this new control scheme to let the player interact with the environment in a more meaningful way, well, you need to give that user more meaningful interactions to perform. And what better way than by making these interactions physically based? After all, if you want a player to use that hand and pick something up, that thing should ideally fall down as well. Picture, if you will, the following scene. You're playing a game on your 1998 computer. You begin at a beach, which leads into a jungle, so you proceed forwards. You come across an area full of random junk, and a blurb of text at the top of the screen tells you that you can use your arm to pick things up. So you do, and you play around in the miniature sandbox for a bit, realizing that items in this world have physics and behave somewhat like real-world objects. They fall, they roll, they knock into each other, and then you see it. A 2x4 and a neatly put together stack of paint cans. Interestingly, the blurb of text comes back, and it's giving you explicit instructions to pick up the 2x4 and doing some more tutorializing, but let's be honest. As soon as you saw it, you knew exactly what you wanted to do. Batter up. If you were actually playing this in 1998, this entire opening sequence would have been your first experience with simulated rigid body dynamics in a video game. Physics was not an entirely foreign concept. After all, if a character jumped, you'd rightly assume that he'd come down at some point. But the idea of trying to render detailed, real-time physics simulations for objects, that was uncharted territory. You see, as inventive as Trespasser was for letting you directly control the arm and hand of your character, that's actually only half the equation. Arguably, the more impactful part of it is that your arm is a physically simulated input that you can use to interface with the world. And the fact that all of this is physically based means that the vocabulary for what you as a player can do completely changes. You're no longer just using or interacting. You're pushing, you're pulling, you're dragging, you're lifting off the ground and carrying. This might seem subtle and unimpressive from a modern perspective, but for its time, this was groundbreaking. Even with its imperfect implementation, the core concept still manages to be impressive, and it helped forge a lineage that can be traced to the present day. For many people, myself included, the idea of a game placing great emphasis on its physics system to do things that had never been seen before had come not from Trespasser, but instead from Half-Life 2, the game that it partially inspired.
Well, end of the line.
By the early 2000s, a company called Havok had created Havok Physics, a powerful middleware that it licensed to game developers so they could integrate physics into their projects. It began gaining popularity and widespread adoption, and is still in use today by major studios. So, when Valve Software wanted their cutting-edge Half-Life sequel to have an emphasis on physics, well, naturally they licensed the best technology available at the time. It's now an iconic part of the game, but you have to consider that at the time, making accurate physics a core design pillar was a considerable risk. The public had already been promised a game that featured physics front and center once before, and they had been burned.
The game is entirely physically based. It's basically a simulation of the island. A simulation of everything on the island, the player, the dinosaurs, all the objects, the plant, the ground, all the buildings and structures. And what that basically means is that you can apply your everyday intuition to everything in the game. You see something you need to get into, you can bust the door down, you can put a plank over the wall, you can do what you think you would do. Nothing is really limited. And that means that you're not solving the puzzle that the designer set up, you're solving the puzzles that you see. You're not always trying to second guess what the game is doing. You're just in an environment and you're trying to solve a problem and get off of it, away from the dinosaurs.
Any other game that made the same bold claims would now be met with skepticism and raised eyebrows. The entire subject now carried a curse, and Valve was nervously aware.
So we wanted to make the world part of the toolbox, part of the game experience as much as we could, which led us to the decision to do physics. So when we had made that decision, the big example in the industry was a game called Trespasser, which ended up being sort of a critical and commercial disaster. So it was a little scarier to actually come to this conclusion that it sounds nowadays when physics are really an accepted part of the game canon.
So it's this level of believable and consistent interactivity that opens the door to a wide variety of new gameplay mechanics.
And this will run on my 486.
In a similar style to Trespasser, Half-Life 2 gives the player some chances to get familiarized with the physics systems from a very early point in the experience. Some of it comes from really subtle sequences. There's a vortigon that sweeps debris, a metrocop that pushes someone and luggage spills onto the floor, a turnstile that you have to go through that spins when you press your body against it, someone brushing something off a table. If a player is curious enough, they might realize early on that trying to interact with random items in the train station will actually cause them to pick those items up, and now they have a choice: put it down gently or throw. Still, the game needs to properly tutorialize it, first by making the player pick up and stack boxes to reach a window, and then through this guy. That's it. He says those 4 words, and it's one of those things that people latch onto and it becomes an iconic part of the franchise. It's at this point that the game officially teaches you to throw. So, you've gone from batting cage to pitcher's mound. Uh-oh. Trespasser would occasionally present the player with a challenge where the result is use physics to succeed, like making a stack of boxes fall down to get a gun, or having to stack them up and reach higher ground. Half-Life 2 borrowed these ideas and, as a result, constantly gives the player opportunities in scripted sequences that involve its fancy new physics engine. Rolling an explosive barrel down a slope to kill some barnacles, using the weight of heavy cinder blocks to make a ramp for yourself, using weight to make a ramp for your boat, using buoyancy to make a ramp for your boat, causing an explosion which crashes a giant gate open. Which is really convenient because it was blocking the way for your boat. Actually, there's a funnier example of these 2 games following the same train of thought. I'm not someone who's big into speedruns, but, you know, occasionally I'll get curious and I'll look one up for a game that I've played from beginning to end. And when I watched a speedrun of Trespasser, I saw this.
I really just need to get better internet. Like, I need to find a way.
Oh my god. Oh my god. He's prop flying? He's fucking prop flying! The exact same thing that people used to do in the early Half-Life 2 speedruns. That's right, the physics systems for these 2 games are so linked together They even have the same fucking mistakes! In Half-Life 2, everything culminates in the player acquiring the gravity gun, the ultimate form of physics as a game mechanic. You can pick things up from far away, and anything even remotely solid is now a deadly projectile. I'm really not exaggerating when I say that the first time I saw this, it was, without a shadow of a doubt, the coolest fucking thing I had ever seen in any game, ever. Many games of the mid-2000s were happy to show off their physics, but I can't think of many that were willing to let you wield it as a weapon. And it's really funny how they tutorialize it too. Oh, you're teaching me to stack boxes to get up somewhere high? Oh, and now I can throw things? Oh, so it's like the same stuff I could do before, but better. Oh. And what's even more amusing is that in Ravenholm, the section that's basically dedicated to starving the player of ammunition and encouraging them to use the gravity gun, one of the best things to throw at zombies is a saw blade. You know, the same thing that forms the Havoc logo? I genuinely don't know if that's intentional or not, but it is hilarious. It's like reinforcing the idea that this whole section is full of death by physics engine. So, the gravity gun quickly becomes another iconic part of the series, and Valve includes it in both episodes going forward. But Half-Life Alyx is a prequel story, and they must have realized that not having it would be a downgrade. So, they compromised by introducing the Russells. You can't use them to throw things at high speed, but it does let you easily pick things up from far away, so, you know, it's good enough, I guess. It's a fun mechanic, and it once again puts emphasis on the physics engine. But there's a key difference. Half-Life 2 lets you experience the power of its accurate physics through a tool that you wield with your own two hands. Half-Life Alyx emphasizes it through your own two hands. This is what starts drawing the comparisons to Trespasser. Having the freedom in both games to just control a limb and using that limb as a physically simulated input in a world that then also tries to create accurate physics simulations, that was the first thing that stood out to me, and the point where I started taking notes and comparing and realizing that it was more than just coincidence that these two games felt related. Something as simple as being able to pick up objects and just feel their weight and how the character struggles to move them or throw them, or using one object to push another, or the fact that my hands actually have collision data, especially in VR, where so many games before just let me pretend I'm a ghost. So much of it feels so similar, but obviously, one is a lot more polished than the other. And that shouldn't exactly come as a big surprise when you consider that the extra polish is the result of decades of both progress and hindsight. Valve definitely had a role to play in showing the industry that making a game with heavy emphasis on its physics wasn't an automatic death sentence, and they definitely made a lot of progress in this technology over time. In the transition from Source to Source 2, Valve tore out the Havoc physics middleware altogether and replaced it with its own in-house implementation known as Rubicon. The details of this new system and how it compares to the old one are not really all that important. All you need to know is that all versions of the Source engine are created with physics as one of its core pillars, and that having the new system be made in-house rather than licensed externally means that it can be more easily adapted to whatever Valve wants to do with it. And for Half-Life Alyx, they wanted to do a lot more than just let the player throw things really hard. The inclusion of a physics engine can have a role to play in how things move and animate. Specifically, it can lessen the reliance on having to animate everything by hand, always. You can instead begin to apply and take advantage of procedural animation. This term carries a lot of weight in the field of computer animation, but it can be distilled down fairly simply. Procedural animation is the act of creating animation as a set of instructions to be followed or rules to be obeyed. In traditional keyframe animation, something moves because an animator chose a specific starting position, ending position, and any other positions in between. With procedural animation, the movement is expressed as commands, which could have been created manually or, and this is the important bit, generated algorithmically. If a single point of a keyframe animation were to change, the end result wouldn't be too drastic compared to the original. But if a single instruction changes in a procedural animation, the end result might be something entirely different. It's for this reason that this technique can be used to generate complex animations very efficiently, as long as the right inputs are provided. If it can all be expressed as functions or program logic, the computer can do the work to create something that an animator would have had to painstakingly craft by hand. This can range from an entire animation created from scratch to simply modifying existing data in real time. If a game implements accurate physics, this opens the door to having its data be used as input. The rules for how the animations are created or tweaked can use information about an entity's mass or velocity, or kinetic forces acting upon it to feed an algorithm. The more capable the physics engine, the more abundant the data. Half-Life Alyx makes very good use of this technique. My favorite example, and it's a real subtle one, but it has to do with the way headcrabs jump. In previous games, the lunge of a headcrab would be an animation of its trajectory, arc, and landing. If something were to block that trajectory, the headcrab would simply keep playing its animation completely unaffected. This has the rather curious side effect of, I'm not sure how else to put this, but it turns a headcrab into a cat. Because as long as it's alive, it will always land on its feet, no matter what. In Half-Life Alyx, on the other hand, blocking its jump will have a more lifelike consequence, as the jumping animation is paused and the physics system is invoked, letting it fall to the floor convincingly and recover before it can try again. Physics-based procedural animation can also be observed in the way in which Combine soldiers move. The developers implemented a method by which pre-made movement could be modified to convincingly show them shifting their weight as they change directions and follow a path. Trespasser also made use of its physics engine for the movement of creatures, and it did so in a way that was quite innovative for its time, maybe even still to this day. Half-Life Alyx can use physics to modify existing animations, but in Trespasser, the entire animation is made from scratch. The game's engine moves creatures with a physically simulated movement model created by Seamus Blackley. It was originally meant to be sold to movie production studios looking for a way to quickly animate creatures, but it was instead repurposed to be used in Trespasser. The game's physics engine drives the animation system dynamically to create strides for the various dinosaurs. It can decide where the feet should be placed to stand still or move with bipedal or quadruped locomotion and adjust the rest of the appendage accordingly. The reason the movement of any creature might look a little weird is because the game is using its physics engine, as janky and primitive as it is, to try and simulate locomotion and then continuously adjust the legs and body. As fascinating as it is on a technical level, the end result is unintentionally hilarious sometimes. Like having a velociraptor trip and fall on a rock when it tried to rush towards me, or another one whose legs are desperately fighting to keep it upright even as it stumbles down the side of a mountain. It tends to look better on larger dinosaurs who move more slowly, but it can still look pretty awkward. Nevertheless, the fact that this system was even considered, let alone attempted, is another mark of just how ambitious the development team was. Physics definitely made Trespasser stand apart back when it was released, even if it was also a big source of its imperfections. Regardless of that, the fact that it would even invite further comparison between it and a game like Half-Life Alyx is another feather in its cap. And there are still a few more left to go, because as much as I have criticized it until now, Trespasser is a masterclass, in how to efficiently give information to a player. If you've watched the last few videos I've made, you might have noticed that I like to sometimes record footage of the games I discuss with no heads-up display, or HUD for short. Nothing on the screen, no health, no ammo counter, no objective markers, nothing like that. Just a raw, clean view of the game and the environment. I like the way it looks, even if I understand that it's not necessarily representative of how a game actually looks. It also helps in doing things like capturing nice B-roll footage, which I'm a fan of doing if the game lets me get away with it. I usually have to rely on mods to do this. Sometimes I'll get lucky and there's a console command or a setting I can use, or sometimes I have to take more extreme measures. Sometimes I just can't do it at all. But this time, thankfully, it was quite simple. Half-Life Alyx allows disabling the HUD for the spectator experience, so that's that taken care of. And Trespasser? Well, this is it. You're already seeing the game as it's intended to be seen. Nothing is missing because there was nothing there to begin with. To anyone who plays video games, having HUD elements present on the screen is something that's so common, you barely ever think about them. Floating text or numbers or icons, they represent an easy and straightforward way to give information to the player. Health bars, score counts, timers, experience points. Despite having decades of progress, they've all stuck around in some way or another, and it's not hard to see why. They're usually the most straightforward way of letting the player know something. You want to give them information? Cool, just plaster it on the screen. They can't miss it. It's a matter of convenience, not necessarily realism. In fact, many games designed to have an emphasis on realism usually start to take some of these HUD elements away. Personally, I've always enjoyed when games try to present information more naturally, if nothing more than because I understand that doing so is usually a design challenge. In an industry where it's common to put a GPS in the corner and a map view that takes up the entire screen, something like Far Cry 2 showing the character using these as physical items can come as such a breath of fresh air. Some games may decide to take away the HUD as a means of removing clutter and enhancing tension. Dead Space replaces the traditional health bar with an indicator in Isaac's suit, and a lot of other information is shown as holograms that can quickly get out of the way as soon as they're not needed. This helps to keep things more grounded. A crosshair for your weapon or a video call isn't something that just shows up on your screen and only you can see. It's something that exists in the game world, and you can see it because Isaac can see it. The developers of Trespasser could have easily relied on HUD elements to show the player their health and their ammo count, and no one would have thought any less of it. And yet, they didn't. Just a few years prior, it wasn't uncommon to take up valuable screen real estate with the grinning face of your protagonist, but instead, they decided to have absolutely nothing. Every pixel on the screen is dedicated to the environment. It really makes you wish it didn't look like shit. However, some information will still need to be presented to the player, and if the game has no HUD, then the development team has to really think outside the box for how to deliver that information. A similar approach is also required when making a game for virtual reality. Since they tend to emphasize immersion, having HUD elements permanently cluttering up your view would be quite distracting. Instead, many games are simply designed not to have them at all, or have them be placed somewhere where the player can check information at will, such as your wrist or somewhere else on your body. This is the approach that was chosen for Half-Life Alyx, and it's a relatively common one for other VR games. All information that needs to be shown to the player is done so via their hands. Health is shown as heart indicators on your non-dominant hand. Look, when it gets too low, you even get a little check engine light that comes on. I like it. It's a cute little detail. It's a reminder that you're wearing a jerry-rigged contraption made out of spare parts. When not holding a weapon, this little screen shows you how much resin you've collected. And when you do have a weapon, it shows you how much reserve ammunition you've got left. When it comes to how much ammunition is left in the weapon itself, however, the designers spent a great deal of effort creating easily readable displays or markings that would always show a player their exact state. Even after upgrading this gun, it can still clearly communicate how much is left in the magazine, the top loader, and the fact that a bullet is chambered and you're ready to shoot. These indicators are, truly, a testament to good visual design. The only other form of heads-up display you get throughout the game are the icons that appear to remind you of what you're carrying in your wrist pockets and the selection of weapons you can choose from, as well as your multi-tool. Admittedly, while all the other indicators feel more grounded in reality, this one feels a bit more video gamey. Other games like Pavlov or Boneworks allow you to manage your equipment by reaching around your own body, but this was not implemented. Still, Half-Life Alyx succeeds at taking away HUD elements that would normally be shown to the player on screen the entire time and making smart adjustments that complement the medium of virtual reality. What's Trespasser's solution? Is there anything on my hand? No? How much health do I have? In all honesty, the game could have made death an entirely binary state. You're either alive or you're dead as soon as you get hurt. Instead, the solution ends up being a lot more interesting. At any point, the player can look down and stare at the protagonist's health bar. Get your mind out of the gutter. The heart tattoo symbolizes the character's health. An outline means full health, with the tattoo becoming gradually more full as damage is taken. This system does end up resembling the one seen in Half-Life Alyx. Not only do they both use heart shapes, but they both revolve around the concept of pausing to check a part of your body and then quickly shifting your focus back to whatever you were doing. By doing this, the health indicator doesn't need to be in view at all times, only when you explicitly want to see it. Managing your equipment is also relatively straightforward and doesn't require HUD elements either. Your character can hold any combination of two different items, and with a single key press, will put one item away and take out the other one. But where things start to get really interesting is not about what information the game will let you see, but what it will let you hear.
8 shots. 7. 6. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1. That's it. Empty.
For managing a weapon's state, the game makes the player rely entirely on audio cues. When they equip a weapon, they get a frame of reference for how much ammunition they have to start with. Then the character counts out loud how many bullets are left, and then you're out. But it gets even more interesting than this, because the audio cues will change if a weapon has a faster fire rate or a larger capacity. The game won't give you an exact count of how many shots are left, only estimates.
Hasn't been used.
This simple change means that suddenly it's a lot harder to maintain a frame of reference for how many times you can shoot. What you gain in ammunition or stopping power, you lose in certainty. The game also has no concept of reserve ammunition, so it doesn't need to deal with it at all. Once a weapon has run dry, that's it. Throw that thing away, you're done. I really want to emphasize that of all the ideas that got thrown at the wall when developing this game, this is the one that genuinely impressed me the most. Sure, a lot of the other concepts are very innovative and very forward-thinking, but they all have problems in some way or another. This one, on the other hand, it's a shining oasis in a desert of flawed execution. It's the product of the design team giving themselves a really difficult limitation to navigate around and then coming up with the most elegant solution possible. It was quite surprising then to see that a remnant of this feature was carried all the way forward.
Last minute.
As a way to alert the player to how much ammo they've got left, Alyx gives them a vocal reminder that's very similar to the ones in Trespasser.
Nearly empty.
And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Half-Life 2 had sound effects for when you were running low or had run out completely.
Ammunition depleted.
So it makes sense that Half-Life Alyx would have a similar feature.
2 shells left. I'm out.
I just didn't expect it to come in the form of a blast from the past. It's impressive how when these two games, developed decades apart by entirely separate teams, both decide to limit themselves in how to present information to a player, they both end up yielding nearly identical results. They came up with similar answers because they had to ask themselves similar questions. But there's one more strand of parallel design that's worth analyzing. After all, if a game implements guns and ammunition, it's also going to give you a reason to use them. Sooner or later, something's probably going to want to shoot you, or maybe even bite you. Trespasser and Half-Life Alyx are both games that are played from a first-person perspective. They both feature guns, and they both feature shooting. But to call either one of these a first-person shooter feels reductive, maybe even inappropriate. First-person shooters were already common and certainly selling quite well at the time of Trespasser's release, and that trend only accelerated more and more by the time of Half-Life Alyx's. But it's difficult to neatly integrate these two into that category. Probably the most glaring difference is just the overall slower pace of combat. Neither game was designed to facilitate a great deal of player mobility. To someone who had cut their teeth playing other shooters in the late 1990s, one glance at Trespasser's combat might make it seem quaint? Perhaps a bit boring? If they want non-stop action with 3D dinosaurs, they're better off playing Turok. Running and gunning was a genre staple of shooters at the time, and arguably still is today to some degree. It's a kind of power fantasy for the player, one in which they're able to take on legions of enemies as they frantically dash around a combat zone, capable of quelling any threat with a hail of gunfire. It's not grounded in reality. It's not representative of what an actual firefight can look like. And yeah, of course not, because it's not meant to be. Instead, it evokes the gun-toting action of cinema, the kind that permeates rampantly through pop culture. Nevertheless, Trespasser went the other way. Running and gunning was discouraged and made basically next to useless because of how inaccurate it would render your shots, not to mention that the game's running doesn't match the speed and fluidity of other shooters of its time. Instead, Trespasser decouples the movement from the shooting and requires from each fight a more deliberate, measured approach. In essence, playing the game is going to make you feel less like an unstoppable action hero and more like a frightened, mortal human being. It should hardly come as a surprise that this style of combat would translate well into virtual reality. Trespasser slowed the movement speed of the player as an attempt at grounded realism. Virtual reality does tend to focus on realism, but movement speed is usually limited as a means of maintaining player comfort. Here's a fun story. When I first got a VR headset, some of the first things that I tried on it were mods for Quake and Half-Life that converted them to VR. I mean, I love both those games and I play them regularly, so surely doing it in virtual reality would be a blast as well, right? Right? Yeah, no. Without seriously turning down the movement speed, I was dizzy, I was in a cold sweat, I was miserable. Trying it again now just to record this footage, I've gotten a little better, but there is no way in hell that I would actually want to play something like this. Necessary or not, however, toning down the movement speed means that I found myself more likely to stay put during combat when compared to other games. I'm constantly stopping to take shots rather than the usual technique of running around like a madman and constantly repositioning. To be fair, Half-Life Alyx does feature teleport movement that you can summon at any time, and you could conceivably use this to quickly move around. However, on the rare occasion that I did use this feature, I found myself only doing so to just put myself behind something solid and then staying there unless something forced me out. But after you've done all this, comes the issue of aiming at a target, a challenge that both of these games handle rather similarly. You know, we really take for granted the fact that aiming a gun in a video game is a pretty easy thing to do. Crosshairs, iron sights, whatever it is that the game ends up having, if you place it over the thing you want to shoot, you can usually rest assured that the shots will go where you intend them. These systems are perfectly serviceable and they've endured for decades now. There's nothing inherently wrong with making it easier for a player to aim at their target. These systems can also go hand in hand with a more brisk movement speed to keep the pace of combat high. They are, however, just more abstraction. In the dawn of first-person shooters, it wasn't uncommon for a game to have no indicator of where exactly your shots would land. They would, however, have other means of helping you aim correctly. Maze War, all the way back in 1974, is often considered to be the first ever first-person shooter. Its rules for aiming at a target are rather simple. If it's in your line of sight, your shot will register. Given the relatively low complexity of the game and its mechanics, this approach makes sense. Early shooters from id Software like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom didn't feature any indicators to help the player aim. That being said, having the weapon placed at the center of the screen, combined with the lack of a vertical axis, makes it possible for a player to line up their shots. Eventually, many games gravitated to the concept of a crosshair to represent where the player was aiming. A plain and simple indicator meant to help narrow down where shots would land down to a fixed point or a predefined area. Some games even implemented dynamic crosshairs, displaying how accuracy would be impacted by doing things like moving or standing still. This is, basically, an abstraction. It's a simplification of the act of aiming a weapon, but it's functional enough to get the job done. The concept is also not exclusive to first-person shooters. Many older games featured shooting mechanics accompanied by some kind of reticle. It was only natural then that the FPS genre would adopt it. It's truly a time-tested mechanic. Point the icon at the bad guy and shoot.
Delta 2-4, this is Alpha 6. We have been compromised. I repeat, we have been compromised. Now heading to extraction point 4.
All of this would then give way to the digital iron sights. As the genre matured and some developers made an effort to make the virtual shooting feel more realistic, this mechanic was implemented in favor of crosshairs. It remains an abstraction, but to an ever so slightly lesser degree. Rather than pointing at a target with a simple shape, the game represents the sights or optics of a weapon. This method ends up being functionally identical to aiming with a crosshair, but the use of real-life iron sights and optics grounds the experience in a more realistic context. But what if you were to go even further? Trespasser, Half-Life Alyx, and by extension most virtual reality games that feature shooting represent the next step forward. Rather than having a weapon's optics automatically line themselves up, it's now entirely up to the player to make the effort if they want to land an accurate shot. As you can imagine, the motion controls of virtual reality make this process quite intuitive. You can hold a virtual pistol or one-handed weapon in the same way that you would a real-life one, and aim it in the same way. The same can't be said of Trespasser. Lining up the sights on a weapon becomes an exercise in patience and frustration as you struggle with a mouse and modifier keys. Even with the precision and freedom of control that virtual reality can grant, I still find myself slowing down during combat because I can't just rely on a guaranteed knowledge that the weapon's sights are perfectly aligned at all times. In Trespasser, the same is true, but the act of correcting yourself is not something that can be done on a whim. Integrate these aiming mechanics with the reduced mobility of the player, and you have a recipe for fights that definitely won't resemble anything you've ever seen before. So, if the capabilities of the player are being modified, the enemies they face will need to be tailored around what the player can or cannot do. In video games, there exists a gameplay trope of something is moving towards you, you need to do something about it, which is as common as it is ancient. Designing an enemy with this idea in mind is fairly simple, at least on paper. All that really needs to be taken into account is how quickly does it move towards the player and what exactly happens when they reach them. A lot of shooters tend to include some kind of enemy that works off of this idea. There's plenty of examples to choose from that basically span the entire history of the genre. The thing is that most games don't really rely on this idea alone for their enemies. Instead, there's usually a variety. Some enemies will rush the player and deal damage up close, others are more likely to hang back and focus on long-range attacks. But what if there wasn't so much variety? Could that still work? Trespasser's enemy roster is made up entirely of things that move towards the player, and by things, I mean different flavors of raptor. Even the final boss is just the same velociraptors, but big. Functionally speaking, there's only one kind of enemy in the game. It's pretty much the polar opposite of variety. And still, somehow, like any of the other mechanics and details in this game, it's a flaw that sort of half works and actually has some good ideas in there somewhere. The thing is, if a player sees an enemy, they can, just barely run away. And if they haven't gotten used to the controls yet, they can barely aim a gun to defend themselves. And even if they wanted to fight, ammunition is so scarce and so limited that it might not even be worth it in the long run. The raptors are designed to be agile, which you would think makes this entirely unfair, but their behavior isn't so straightforward. It takes them some time to start giving chase, and even when they do, it's not always a straightforward rush. They bob and they weave and they pause and they move erratically. Suddenly all of the subtle imperfections and the jank of the physics engine and the animation system and the pathfinding and all of these compounding issues, they add up and they work in the player's favor, and it buys them just a little more time to shoot or to run. When you put all of this together, this game makes it so that seeing so much as one raptor, it triggers this fundamental fight or flight response. You're constantly scanning around the environment. You're looking out for them. You're keeping track of how many there are. You're gauging their distances. You're wondering if any of them have seen you yet, if it's moving aimlessly or if it's starting to make its way towards you. And if it is, how much time do you have to react before you are completely screwed?
That's it. Feels full.
Six rounds.
4.
Half-Life Alyx's first combat sequences are going to be against the traditional headcrab zombies that, if you've played the previous games, you have fought time and time again. So, as you can imagine, I thought I knew exactly what to expect. Oh, it's a zombie? No problem. I have dealt with a few of these before. And yet, to my surprise, when you're put in virtual reality, a basic headcrab zombie feels like more of a threat than ever before. In the previous games, the tactic for fighting them is fairly easy to grasp. You either melee them and avoid their attacks, or you blast them away with whatever weapon you've got in hand. But in VR, that's not going to be so trivial anymore. Half-Life Alyx has no melee combat to speak of, so shooting is your only option. To do that, you have to stand still and take aim, and especially in the early areas, try and hit its weak spots to take it out with as few bullets as possible. Granted, they can't hurt you as long as they're far away, but they're constantly moving towards you. You can try and run, but unless you're spamming the teleport, you can't do so very quickly. So you've got to act, and you don't have all the time in the world to do it. Is this starting to remind you of something? Suddenly, fighting these really basic enemies from the previous games, there's a much more palpable sense of tension and risk. They feel like a genuine danger. Aiming for a headshot isn't as easy as just moving a crosshair, and with every step they take, they're getting closer and closer, and your chances of running away unscathed are slowly diminishing. Combat designers had to deal with important limitations, like how the reduced mobility in VR means that enemies should never quickly invade the player's space and make them feel overwhelmed. This is precisely the opposite approach of the previous game. For example, Half-Life 2 was happy to throw legions of manhacks at the player. Half-Life Alyx, just a few at a time. Half-Life 2 relies on being able to swarm the player as a way to increase the challenge, and there's a very clear example of this idea at work. Up until Black Mesa East, the player has only fought headcrab zombies which behave very similarly to the ones seen in the first Half-Life. The game shifts between fighting these and Combine enemies, so there's enough variety to keep the player entertained. But then comes Ravenholm, and there won't be anything else to fight but the undead. Understandably, having nothing but the same slow zombie to kill over and over again would lose its charm pretty quickly. So, the designers made a variation of the same enemy. If the regular zombie was slow and lumbering, why not make another which would be much more nimble and agile? What resulted from this, now known as the fast zombie, became just as iconic and recognizable, yet infinitely more frightening. Half-Life 2 and its episodes are filled with enemies where a big part of the challenge is how quickly they can close the gap. Fast zombies swarm the player, so do the antlions. The Combine shotgunner charges at you and can quickly kill you, so can a zombine, so can a hunter, so can the antlion guard. The game establishes and builds up several enemies that are now iconic to the franchise, and then for Half-Life Alyx, none of it works. At least not without substantial overhauls.
In some of our early experiments bringing Half-Life 2 enemies to VR, we found that antlions in particular showed promise and were interesting to fight, but tended to quickly overwhelm playtesters. They were able to get into the player's physical space too quickly, and applied so much pressure that players just ended up endlessly teleporting around trying to get away. Around the same time, we were discovering that all players, even relative novices, have surprisingly good aim in VR. The variability of aiming ability amongst players is simply much lower in VR than it is in mouse and keyboard games. To take advantage of the idea that players would consistently be able to make precise shots, we started testing an antlion design which players could slow down by shooting off the legs. Playtesters reacted positively to both the need for accuracy and the organic feeling that this gave the antlions when their legs flew off and the injured antlion continued to limp toward them.
As much as virtual reality might seem like a cumbersome limitation when designing combat, requiring that so many things be adjusted or removed, if this example with the antlions proves anything, it's that it can have quite a lot to give back as a result of your sacrifice. More often than not, ideas which would be too simplistic for a traditional shooter might end up being the optimal solution. In the case of the zombies, you don't need to make a special mutation for virtual reality that makes them more fun like in Half-Life 2. Virtual reality by itself is the mutation. This by itself can be enough to both keep the player interested, but also ensure that the experience is balanced around the player's limits. By having to strictly adhere to these kinds of constraints, Half-Life Alyx's combat against zombies or antlions begins to resemble the kind of combat that was present in Trespasser. There's a creature that can tear you apart, getting closer and closer, like a lit fuse crawling its way to a powder keg, so it demands a reaction. The main difference is that Trespasser's combat is just as much a product of careful design as it is unintentional mistake. Every time I walk away from a fight in one piece, I feel like I somehow got lucky, like I exploited the game's issues in just the right way, and I'm living on borrowed time. In Half-Life Alyx, on the other hand, it feels like everything is painstakingly crafted so that the player can have the best possible experience. Seeing that zombie or antlion make its way towards you triggers the same fight or flight response, but the game leans more towards making the player feel empowered and confident in tackling the challenge, rather than anxious. That doesn't mean, however, that the game will never present the player with more tense or challenging fights, but to do that, you're gonna need more than zombies and bugs. I was glad to see that the Combine were being transitioned to virtual reality even at an early prototyping stage. Although they were a major part of the previous game, I wouldn't put it past Valve to just remove them if they couldn't be made to work well in VR. Maybe not entirely, they'd probably keep them around in scripted sequences, reminding the player that this is City 17 after all. As it turns out, my suspicions were only partially correct. Interestingly, Civil Protection, the one Overwatch unit that's immediately recognizable from Half-Life 2, is used entirely as set dressing. For Combine units that you actually have to fight against, well, like many other aspects of this game, it definitely feels like Valve had to go back to the drawing board. The end result, I feel, strikes a good balance between the familiar and the practical. As the most common units, Combine grunts and ordinals are going to be fought the most often. They behave somewhat similarly to the player. Their main priorities will be to find cover and shoot from a distance. They'll try to maneuver themselves into a flanking position or try to flush the player out with grenades, but they're not likely to come into close proximity. Their firing pattern consists of single shots or controlled bursts, enough to hurt, but not enough to keep you from firing back. To keep a player pinned down, that is someone else's job. The role of a Combine suppressor is ultimately that of a sentry. They operate best at elevated positions, and they too will stand their ground and not come too close. Instead, it will lay down covering fire meant to keep the player suppressed and discouraged from moving around. That is, while the ammunition lasts. Only one Combine unit is allowed to try and close the gap, and it manages to strike fear just from the sound of its footsteps. Combine Charger is a frightening menace, intimidating and unavoidable. They present the same kind of threat that a zombie or an antlion would, in the sense that the danger greatly increases if it gets up close and personal. A Charger's focus is on constantly moving forward and pushing towards the player, creating a sense of urgency, with the loud metallic thump of every step reminding you that he's only getting closer. They make for a high priority target, one which should be ideally dealt with early to avoid the advance. However, take too many shots and a shield will be deployed. It's at this point that the game wants you to make a horrifying realization. You must allow the advance, but prepare an ambush. So, despite only having these 3 Combine units, I found myself having more interesting engagements against them than ever before. Half-Life 2 did feature different types of Combine, but Half-Life Alyx makes these units much more distinct from a gameplay point of view. In most games, fights tend to be more interesting if each enemy has unique ways of attacking or being attacked. Their presence or absence requires a strategic approach, and their arrangement dictates the flow of battle. The combat of Half-Life and Half-Life 2 might be rooted in the mayhem of its contemporaries, but by adapting to virtual reality, Half-Life Alyx, whether accidentally or on purpose, re-implements the same ideas of Trespasser. It takes every component and polishes it to a mirror shine, and when they all come together, it creates a lethal, elegant dance. In the field of technology, there exist a myriad of examples of products or ideas that can be referred to as being ahead of their time. This usually applies retroactively, with a key component being that the failed idea or product has to be re-implemented in a future context and therefore, in a sense, exonerated. Trespasser was, undoubtedly, ahead of its time. It strived for gameplay and pacing and world design and mechanics that wouldn't successfully all come together until decades after it was released. Its ideas reborn from their competitor. Valve is known for being quite an unusual company, and their position in the games business is one that very few get to enjoy. They focus a lot on their core technology and on using said technology to solve problems. They want every new game, especially every new Half-Life game, to be the answer to a specific design challenge, to usher forth a new set of ideas for the industry to rally behind. Any finished and released product lies atop a mountain of other experiments, all of which take time and are not always going to yield useful results. To their audience, it can sometimes evoke that dreaded question, what took you so long?
The short answer is that it took us this long to make something that we were happy with. The long answer requires a look at our development process. At its core is the assumption that we don't really know ahead of time what will be fun. We know what's been fun in the past, but if we've got 3 ideas on the table, we really can't say for sure which one will be the most fun when they're done. So we've focused on developing a repeatable process that we'll find out. It's based on a cycle of constant iteration, where evaluation is done by watching as many people play the game as possible.
Much of that iteration is done by Valve internally, but it would be an understatement to say that a large amount of the company's legacy stemmed from its willingness to build on the work of others. From the moment they were formed in 1996, Valve positioned itself as a group that wanted to show off the very best of what video games as a medium were capable of. But they weren't the only ones. From everything I've learned about the crew at DreamWorks Interactive, these people were all cut from the same cloth. They had that same spark of creativity, that same level of investment and care for what they were working on. Whatever word or term it is that you want to assign to it, be it passion or drive or tenacity, they had it. Of all the research I had to do, my favorite discovery, by far, is a 25-page internal developer walkthrough. In it, a designer opens by referring to it as, quote, a document to help us monitor the question, are we making a game up to our potential? Do we have enough interesting things in the game? Have we fulfilled the potential of the engine and of our imaginations? Does the game rock? History can sometimes be very unkind to anyone other than those in first place. The 1990s was quite a memorable decade for video games. It's gone on to become a somewhat romanticized period for the history of the medium, a kind of golden age. But for every studio or intellectual property fondly remembered today, there exist many more who, for some reason or another, didn't quite make the cut, but are no less worthy of remembering. There's a reason to care about fossils. They're surviving records of a bygone era, a reminder of our history. They can help us better understand our past and maybe even predict our future. We learn from them, we respect them, we showcase them in museums for the whole world to see. As gut-wrenchingly cliché as it might sound, Jurassic Park Trespasser, a game explicitly about the products of paleontology, is itself a fossil of a video game. It's an unusual, avant-garde experiment from a company that doesn't even really exist anymore. There's a lot of things you can say about it, and A lot of them are probably pretty unflattering, but you'd have to admit that it's, at the very least, unbelievably fascinating. It's a reminder that there was once a time when things were not as set in stone as they are today, when there were many frontiers left to conquer, experiments yet to be done, discoveries yet to be made, a glimpse of a future fast approaching. It crumbled under the weight of its own massive ambition, and you can't help but wonder what it could have been. Half-Life Alyx is, today, the pinnacle of what virtual reality can accomplish, but we can't forget about the long relay race that culminated in its release. Trespasser and the company behind it might be gone, but its ideas linger still.
Creation is an act of sheer will. And next time, it'll be flawless.